What's up guys, Intellitech Mobile here, and today we'll be doing a review on the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G. Probably the best budget phone that I've ever used. Now, obviously it's kind of budget, kind of mid-range, but it's definitely the first semi-budget phone that I've ever recommended. This particular phone is great, and this is the most enjoyment that I've ever gotten out of a mid-range phone, and the fact that this isn't even technically the current version of it is like fantastic. It's amazing. I'm actually blown away at how good this is. A lot of times, whenever I use a budget phone, I end up feeling like it's just a terrible experience. I always end up having issues where I just feel like the device is slow, or it stutters and it lags, or the build quality isn't good, or the camera sucks, or usually it's a combination of all of those issues. But this time, that's not the case. The Galaxy A53 5G, for what I paid, I mean, I only paid $140 for this, but even if you can find this for like around 160 or maybe even 170, this is still a solid phone. Now, the thing is that I still generally recommend that you buy an older flagship phone instead of buying a new mid-range phone or new budget phone, just for the simple fact that you're repurposing old devices, it's better for the environment, you're producing less e-waste, and of course you have a device that, especially now that Samsung's gotten better at updating their older phones, that actually has a decent secondary life, especially when you consider the fact that it was never designed to hit a price point in the first place. Of course, there's some exceptions, but a lot of these devices will generally have issues with age, and these days that's not really an issue, even with the mid-range phones. So this phone is great. But let's get into specifics. Let's not just rant and rave about it. What all is there about this? Now, of course, this phone has face unlock, and it has an in-screen fingerprint sensor. Now, the in-screen fingerprint sensor is a little bit lower than I'm used to on devices like the Notes or just any of the ultrasonic fingerprint sensors. This one's an optical sensor. A lot of times you can see the light shining through your finger whenever you access it, but I actually prefer this to the one on the flagships, believe it or not, because I feel like it's significantly faster, and I don't think I've ever had to, other than of course the times where you're not lined up with it, you can't really fault it for that. But if I'm lined up with it, it always works 100% of the time. As soon as I say that, the one time that I'm filming it, it doesn't do it. But yeah, see, I was a little bit too high up, but whenever I'm down, I get it every time, and it's pretty decent. And we'll go ahead and turn down the brightness on this a little bit so it's a bit easier to see. Now, you've got a decent display. By default, you actually have a high refresh rate display, but I always turn that off. On here, they call it motion smoothness, but I personally can't deal with the 120 hertz refresh rate. It really hurts my eyes, and a it gives me a lot of motion sickness, so I personally can't use that. Although I did try to use it for at least testing purposes, and I didn't use it long enough to determine if there is any difference in battery life, but other users have mentioned that putting it on the standard mode does increase the battery life. And for what it's worth, in the mode that I use it in, which is standard mode, the 60 hertz, the battery life on this is excellent. And this is, of course, a used phone. Like, it's, ooh, hands all greasy. It's obviously, someone had it for a little bit and used it. This is actually a Verizon variant, so this is the 5G UW. And this particular phone, I did install the unlock firmware on it to avoid any of the Verizon bloatware. But be careful if you're like me and you're trying to install the unlock firmware on a lot of your Samsung phones. The UW variant is different than the standard 5G variant, so I kept trying to install the firmware from the standard A53 5G, and the UW, which is the Verizon variant, does require its own separate firmware. But there are factory unlocked versions of the UW version. So that is nice. So I was able to flash that and get rid of all the Verizon bloatware and boot screen and all that crap. So, one other thing to mention is that I got this device for so cheap because it was blacklisted on Verizon. So obviously you can't put a Verizon SIM in this, otherwise it will zap your SIM card. But I've been using Mint Mobile, Q-Link Wireless, and Cricket on here, and it's worked great. So obviously that is one thing that you could always do, is you could find one that's carrier blacklisted for a carrier where their phones are unlocked, and then just not use it on that carrier, and then you're still okay. I did it with my US Cellular Note 9. I've done it with a lot of devices. You know, this Note 20 I think is T-Mobile blacklisted. This Note 7 is obviously Verizon blacklisted. So there's a lot of devices like that where even if they're blacklisted, if you get them on a carrier that you're not using, as long as they themselves are also unlocked, or you're using an NVMO for that carrier, then it should be fine. It's a little tip that I always tell people because, again, it means less e-waste and it means more devices are able to be out there. So, I mean, yeah, I guess theoretically, oh no, you're using a phone that the giant mega corporation that does all these immoral things didn't quite get their cut for a overpriced phone. Oh, boo-hoo. But anyways, so this particular phone has a nice plasticky back and plasticky sides, which is not actually a bad thing. I love the way this phone feels. It's got chunky sides, and this thing has nice flat edges. It has a nice flat screen. It gives you something to grip onto. There was one time where I pulled it out of my pocket upside down and I couldn't tell because it's the very similar style on both sides, very reminiscent of the old Note 7 in that regard, kind of symmetrical on both sides. But besides that, which only happened once, and you know that doesn't really bother me too much. I actually prefer the symmetrical design. This thing is very comfortable. Using it in the winter now, like a plastic phone is really nice because it's soft, it doesn't feel harsh in your skin, or in your skin, on your skin. It's nice and soft, but it's also still sturdy feeling because the type of plastic they use is very sturdy. It's not the really soft. It's more dense than the plastic on the older Galaxy phones, like for example the Note 3 or the S4. So if we take like an older Galaxy phone like the S4 had really, really soft plastic, which, again, they feel equally good in your hand, but the problem with the S4 is the plastic was very thin, and it wasn't very dense plastic, so if you dropped it, you would actually have the plastic get crushed in and break the glass as a result. That's not a problem with this phone. I haven't dropped it too many times, but from what I've seen from the drop tests, it does seem pretty sturdy, although the tolerances on the inside don't seem to be as good as the flagship phones. So there is a possibility that if you drop it, the screen could like come unplugged or something like that, and you have to open it up and reattach it. Now, obviously this isn't a rugged phone, but if you don't drop your phone very often, then you could totally get away with using this without a case. There's no curved screen, so as long as you don't drop it perfectly flat, if you drop it anywhere else but perfectly flat, it's going to survive. And of course the camera's encased in plastic too, so you're not going to break that either. The worst thing you're going to do is just dent and scuff up the phone. So, now granted, this is a phone that I've really enjoyed using without a case, and because of how grippy it is, I have not yet to drop it. Whereas there's a lot of other Galaxy phones, like the Note series, where they're just so slippery that you're tempted to drop them. This is not a problem. Much in the same way that I noticed with my Galaxy Z Fold 3, both these phones are chunky and dense enough that you don't actually want to drop it. Or, not want, but you're not as tempted for it to slip away from your grip. I think you know what I'm trying to say. It's easy to hold on to. It's not something that you're worried is going to slip out of your hand super easy. So this is, and with how budget this phone is, you could totally skip out on using a case, because if you scuff it up, who cares? I mean, it's a cheap phone. But it still doesn't, but the build quality is still sturdy enough that it doesn't feel like a cheap phone. It's structurally rigid. It's very dense. But because it's plastic, it's still lightweight. It's not a super heavy brick. Again, super apples and oranges comparison, but this thing's an absolute brick, the Fold 3. But obviously this is not the same device in terms of style, so obviously it's not a fair comparison. But when you compare it to something very similar looking and very similar size-wise, like the Note 20, this is infinitely lighter weight. So even though the actual design is not all that far off. So this is infinitely lighter, but that's actually quite nice. It means that despite it being a big screen and everything, it doesn't feel unwieldy. And if you're like me and you use your phone in bed and you're laying down and you drop your phone on your face, don't lie, we've all done it. If you have a lighter weight phone, it doesn't hurt as bad. So there's definitely a positive. You don't want to drop this on your face. I haven't done it yet, but when I do, you might have a broken nose. So, I know I've been kind of all over the place with this review, and a lot of times that tends to happen. I'm very kind of ADHD in that regard. I like to make my reviews feel like we're just two friends talking about a phone, and I'm telling you what there is to know about this, and you're basically not interrupting me because you want to be polite and not cut me off because you're worried that you're going to hurt my feelings. Well, the good news is that you can't, because, well, I guess you could turn off the video. But hopefully this will lead to some interesting information that helps you purchase a device. And we'll talk about one of the next things that always tends to get, oh, of course, I accidentally, see, that's one of the problems with these on-screen fingerprint sensors, is I always accidentally trigger them. But one of the things that's actually really good about this phone, as you notice, like every other Galaxy phone, there's no camera shortcut on my home screen. Double tap the power button, just like every Galaxy, and you get the camera. And this camera is amazing. Like, obviously, it's not as good as like a full-on flagship Galaxy, but the simple fact that it's competitive and like really holds its own. Like, this camera is like really, really solid. Like, I don't have any complaints with this. I do notice with the video, when I'm recording video on this, it does seem like the color temperature is a little bit washed out on video, but with photos, it does great. So, I mean, I'll try to scroll through and find some pictures. I mean, here's a thumbnail I took of a vacuum I reviewed on my other channel. You know, a lot of people pointed out that it has kind of an orangish tone to it, and of course this isn't going to show up on this Note 10's camera very well, but you've definitely got that. And if I scroll through, I'm trying to see some other pictures. You know, here's a cat picture, quite nice, beautiful potato. And if we scroll in, see, it's quite a nice potato, very orange, very fluffy. You can see the hole punch as well, which is really, really small in this phone and doesn't really bother me, so that's also a plus as well. I definitely do like this type of hole punch more than the teardrop notch these days, so that's also a great improvement. And the bezels are fairly even. They're a little thicker on the bottom than on the top, but what are you going to do? And of course you have the buttons. Now you can swap it to the swipe gestures as well, but I always prefer the buttons, so that's the way that I choose to use it. And of course I just hit the tripod. Sorry about that. So the camera on this is excellent. Of course you're not going to have every single mode from all the newer cameras, but for what most people need a camera for, it's solid. And I could honestly get by with this for my channel if I absolutely had to. And, you know, the simple fact that I could get by with this is great. In fact, you know, if I wasn't giving this to my mother-in-law, I would totally actually keep this as a backup phone because that's how much I like it. Now, next we'll talk about performance. Now, here's an interesting riddle that I'm going to present to you. What does this device and this device both have in common? Well, if you would say specs, specifically hardware specs, you'd be exactly right. Both of these phones have expandable storage, and they have 128 gigs of storage with 6 gigabytes of RAM. So, the A53 5G, if you're coming from a Note 9, which it seems like kind of a strange upgrade, but it's definitely one that's possible, the experience in terms of specs are very similar. And just like the Note 9 is still a great phone in terms of performance, the A53 5G is just as good. In fact, I argue it's a little bit better. Possibly, it's like slightly better, if for no other reason than it has a newer version of Android that's less prone to a lot of the bugs that I've noticed with older Samsung phones. Like my Note 9 and a lot of older Samsung phones, when I have a lot of notifications and I'm trying to scroll down the notification shade, a lot of times when I'm trying to scroll down the notification shade, what'll happen is it'll freeze for half a second and then populate the whole shade. And then as I start to scroll through, it'll then attempt to populate more that were previously missing, and then when I'm trying to scroll, it'll start ripping the thing down away from my hands. It's kind of hard to describe, but it makes it to where you can't really use the notification shade for like maybe 10 seconds, or not 10 seconds, like 5 seconds, and it gets a little annoying after a while. Now, of course, a lot of people in my life would tell me, well, just clear your notifications and stop leaving all your notifications there. But I like to leave my notifications. I don't like to get rid of my notifications because I want to leave the notification there until I can address it, you know, later on. So, on the A53 5G, that's actually a bug they finally addressed with the newest version of One UI, which is Android 13. So, that's excellent. So, one of the biggest things I complained about, it wasn't a deal breaker for me, obviously, because I've been using Notes ever since the Note 3, but that does make it to where it's a little quality of life improvement that makes using the phone a lot better. And the A53 5G has that advantage over even some older flagships like the Note 9. So, of course, one thing that you're not going to get from the Note 9, in fact, we'll run down all the things you don't get from the Note 9, because the Note 9 is my favorite phone of all time, so it's kind of my benchmark for like what a phone has. Because if they made an updated version of this, if they made a Note 9 FE with a wide-angle camera and maybe a couple other like hardware improvements, I would totally buy this. But obviously, you're not going to get a physical fingerprint sensor on the back, which isn't quite as nice. You're also not going to get a heart rate monitor. You're not going to get a headphone jack. And of course, in addition to headphone jack, you're not going to get an S Pen, obviously. Like, you're not going to get a Bluetooth S Pen. So, what are you going to do? You're not going to get an S Pen, but it's not a Note. You don't expect that. But yeah, no headphone jack is a little annoying, but on a device like this, I can forgive it. And I've been daily driving the Note 10 for a while, as well as the Note 20, and now the Fold. So I'm used to not having a headphone jack. I keep a dongle in my wallet, and that's not ideal, but the simple fact is that's just what you're going to have to do these days. And at least on this device, there's enough of a price cut that it feels a bit more justified. Of course, Bluetooth on this works just fine. I've used this with my Galaxy Buds, and I've used this with other headphones like my Sony's, and it's been just fine. No issues there. So all of that is exactly what you'd expect. Now, what else is there to mention? Well, of course, like a lot of the newer Galaxy phones, by default, you have to actually map the Bixby button to the power button. If you hold this, there is side key settings. So you got to do that. But other than that, you can pretty much ignore Bixby. I don't deal with Bixby. And the nice thing is that even on Samsung's stock interface, there's now just, well, Google Now. It just now has Google Now, which is, I don't know when they did this, but it's great. So it's actually to the point now where I actually enjoy Samsung's stock launcher enough to use it. Now, generally, I use Microsoft Launcher, but on this phone, I wanted to keep it completely fresh and stock. And I did. And the Samsung keyboard has actually seen some improvements as well. But of course, I usually prefer SwiftKey. So I'm usually in the Microsoft ecosystem when it comes to launcher and keyboard. But this phone, I do like the animations as well whenever you open apps, how they kind of pop up from where you have them on the home screen. So that's kind of cool. And the inbuilt wallpapers are pretty cool too. Again, most of this stuff doesn't matter to people, but it's a nice little touch. The point that I'm trying to make is this doesn't feel like an incomplete experience, despite it being a budget Galaxy. You still have access to all the theming options and all the dark mode and all the features and blah, blah, blah. Pretty much all that stuff you still have access to. You still have always on display, and it works very well. There's just, again, there's nothing missing here except wireless charging. I really don't like that. If this thing had wireless charging, I would keep my SIM card in it. Legitimately. That's how good this thing is. But for me, wireless charging is very, very important. Obviously, I can get around it. I've obviously been using this phone just plugged in, and it charges very fast. I haven't even looked up to see what the maximum like charging speed this thing can take, but on my 25-watt charger, it juices up just fine. It doesn't seem really any different in terms of charging speeds than my Note 20 and Note 10. Maybe a little bit slower, but that's splitting hairs at this point. And this thing, of course, has a big giant battery, so you don't have to worry about the thing running out of space. Now, I pulled up AccuBattery on this. Okay, well, apparently I haven't set it up yet, so I guess I can't reference that. But this phone has a something battery. I just forgot what it was, so now I have to look it up. But the point is that in real life, I had no issues with the battery life. And unless yours is super worn down and beat down, I don't think you're going to have any issues either. Now, I'm not exactly familiar with how well this device pulls apart, so I'm not really sure if there is... Oh, I just activated the edge panel. And that's one thing that's kind of weird. You have the edge panels, which is weird because this isn't an edge screen phone, but obviously there's no practical reason for them to remove it. So you've got that as well. So if you really like the edge panels for some reason, but you also don't like a curved screen, this has that. So that's pretty good. So let's see. If we go back, so the minimum battery capacity for this device is 4860. But of course, they advertise it as a 5,000 milliamp hour battery, which that is fantastic. Like, legitimately, a 5,000 milliamp hour battery in this phone with an SoC that just sips power, it's great. Again, I mentioned how great the battery life is. I can go through an entire day without even stressing out about the battery, and I might get home at like, 30% maybe 25%. And that's with me having the protect battery feature on. So I'm starting at 85 versus starting at 100. If you started at 100 versus 85, you could probably go even further. But for me, I like to turn on the protect battery option. I don't like to charge it above the 85%, so I always turn on the protect battery option, and I highly recommend you do so as well. Even if it costs you a little bit of battery life, it's going to protect your battery more so long term, and I think that's just much better. So I always have the protect battery option on these newer Galaxies, so I'm always starting from 85%, not from 100%. And a lot of times by the time I get out the door, it's usually like 83 or 82. But hey, that's still great. From 80 to 20 all day, and still a bit of juice left in the tank. This is the best battery life out of any phone that I currently have, which says a lot. So that right there is great. Amazing battery life, really good performance, solid camera, decently fast charging, micro SD expansion. It's actually built into the SIM card tray. It's on the other side of it. And I did put a 256 gig SD card, and it works just fine. So all that's really good. And with how many times I've seen people complain about the A54 5G, I actually think this might be a better buy because it's the last generation of the mid-range, so you're going to find these for super cheap. And honestly, I like the design of this better. It doesn't look like just a knockoff of the S22. It looks like an actual own device with its own sort of design language. So yeah, anyways, this was Intellitech Mobile signing out with the Galaxy A53 5G and a bunch of other phones. Here's an S4, here's a Galaxy Fold, here's a Note 7, here's a Note 20. I have a lot of notes, obviously. So there's a bunch of phones. But anyways, this review is finally over. A53 5G gets a solid recommendation from me, and at the end of the day, that's all there is to it. I will see you guys in the next video. Time for a burrito break, and I hope you all have a good one.
That was easy.